Yes, I don't have so much problems, so I can share my I hope it works. Mm, here's the video. And please let me know if you can see my screen. I will share audio too.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I will do a little test about the audio. Hello everyone. Today we are going to present our book report. Can you hear the video?
Mm-hmm. I mean,
Perfect.
I could. I don't know about the rest.
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
I will play my video. Hello everyone. Today we are going to present our book report about the poem On Being Brought from Africa to America by the author Phillys Wheatley. We are Barbara Diaz and Luciano Vargas. Poet Phillys Wheatley was brought to Boston, Massachusetts, on an enslaved Persian ship in 1761, and was bought by John Wheatley as a personal servant to his wife. The Wheatleys educated Phyllis, and she soon mastered Latin and Greek, going to write highly acclaimed poetry. Wheatley received lessons in theology, English, Latin, and Greek. Ancient history was soon folded into the teachings, as were lessons on mythology and literature. At a time when African Americans were discouraged and intimidated from learning how to read and write, Wheatley's life was an anomaly. In 1773, Wheatley gained considerable stature when her first and only book of verse, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was published. In publishing it, Wheatley became the first African American and first U.S. enslaved person to publish a book of poems, as well as the third American woman to do so. Having been freed from slavery, she later married and struggled financially, with Wheatley unable to find a publisher for her second volume of poems.
In terms of the historical context, the main thing that we have to bear in mind is slavery in America, because the European colonization of the Americans inspired a great desire for cheap labor because they wanted to develop the land. The enslavement of Africans in the American colonies grew steadily from the early 17th century until by the 1860s, where there were about 4 million slaves in the United States. Slavery did not become illegal after the Revolution as many had hoped, and it was not fully abolished in the United States until the end of the Civil War in 1865. You can imagine that they were brought over on slave ships, as Whitley was, having been kidnapped or sold by other Africans, and then they were used for field labor or as household workers. Then later generations of slaves were born into captivity. Most of them were held on the southern plantations. However, some of them were house servants in the north because the most wealthy families were expected to have them. As an example, we have the Whitley family, and they had several slaves, but the poet was treated from the beginning as a companion to the family, which meant that she was above the other servants, which wasn't very common, as you can imagine as well. Now here we have the poem, On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some be our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train.
In terms of the plot, as the name says, the poem is about an African slave girl who is being brought from Africa to America. And the characters are two, the speaker, a slave who was brought from Africa to America, and God.
In terms of the analysis, in this poem we can see that the speaker contends with being brought from America and calls this a merciful act as their benighted soul was taught to understand that there's a God and a Savior. So the speaker explains to us that they were taught to understand the existence of a God and a Savior, but this doesn't really mean that the speaker is accepting these figures. So even though the speaker neither sought nor knew redemption at one point, the first four lines of the poem do not necessarily indicate that the speaker now accepts redemption or a God or a Savior. Then we have that the speaker is indicating to us that some may view black people with a scornful eye, saying that their color is diabolic. Line 7 says Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, and that provides a biblical reference to describe black people and places Christians and black people next to each other within the same line, and this is indicating equality. So the speaker subverts the notion that black people are diabolic by saying that they can join the angelic train. So this poem is insisting on the equality of all people under God and asserts that those who say black people are diabolic are misguided. They are not right. So then the first four lines of this poem may also be tinged with sarcasm, because many of her later poems denounce the violence that brought her to America, separating her from her family and leading to her enslavement. Indeed, then in later poems, Wheatley calls into question Christians who believe enslavement and see enslaved Africans as inferior. So even though she was treated better than other slaves, she was still a slave, and she's trying to make us understand this.
The rhyme scheme of On Being Brought from Africa to America is a single stanza made up of 8 lines and has an A, B, B, C, C, and D, D rhythmic structure. As we can observe in the poem, they rhyme the word land with understand, the word new with to, die and I, cane and train. The poem is written using heroic couplets. They were the in thing for all the poets back in Whitley's day. They are called heroic because in the old days of English poetry, they were used to talk about the trials and adventures of heroes. Heroic couplets totally ruled the poetry scene for a long time, especially during the 17th and 18th century. In the poem, there were two constructive lines of verse in an heroic couplet, usually in the same meter and joined by rhyme. There are 4 heroic couplets in this poem. The poem was also written using the iambic pentameter, and this was a kind of rhythmic pattern that consists of 5 iambs per line, almost like 5 heartbeats. For example, like da doom, da doom, da doom, da doom, like a heartbeat, but 5 times. And her poetic style was also about reason, form, and restraint. She wasn't a romantic poet, using all sorts of flowery language and overflow emotions. She stayed cool, used reason, and never colored outside the formal lines. The poem follows the iambic pentameter. For example, "Twas mercy brought me from my pagan."
Now we have the setting, the narrator, and the point of view. Well, in terms of the setting, the title gives it all away. The poem takes place in America, but it also tells us the setting that was left behind, because the speaker is referencing her homeland, which was Africa. But we know that she left. We don't know anything about her old home, neither her new one, because we lack details. The speaker is more concerned about the landscape of her own soul. So we could say that she's focusing on the fact that she has been saved. Her identity as a black woman and a converted Christian is serving as the intellectual setting of the poem. So, in other words, her poem takes place in America, but it also happens to be talking about the racial tensions of the late 18th century when the author was writing. So, when she says things like savory race and diabolic die, she's not talking about an actual place, but about cultural norms of racism that she struggled with in America. Now, in terms of the narrator, we can never assume that the speaker is the same person as the poet. But since the title of this poet is about um, being taken from Africa to America, and we know that Phillys Wheatley was taken from Africa to America, we can at least guess that the poem is somewhat about her. Therefore, others claim that the poem describes Wheatley's experience as a young girl who was enslaved and brought to the American colonies in 1761. Finally, the point of view corresponds to a first person point of view because the speaker is telling their own story.
Themes. Although her poems typically address Christianity and avoid issues of race, On Being Brought from Africa to America is a short but powerful poem about slavery. In fact, people could hardly believe that a slave could actually read and write, let alone write poems. Mercy, racism, and divinity are the major themes in this poem. Throughout the poem, the speaker talks about God's mercy and the indifferent attitude of the people toward the African American community. Though people speak that everyone is equal for God, they never let them enjoy the blessings of life as white people. Rather, they treat people of color like animals, which ultimately damage their mental health. In the poem, Whitley uses Christianity to shed light on racial inequality that she experiences firsthand, aiming to break down notions about race. We've all had moments when our assumptions were upset and we learn something new about others. When we are confronted with ideas challenging our perceptions, we can learn something new about ourselves, to which expands our understanding of the world.
Now we have symbolism. In line 1, the speaker says that she was brought, but in other words, her location was changing from Africa to America. But there's more to that. It was mercy that's bringing her. So she moves physically, but mercy cannot brought her. So what we have here is personification, which is reflecting a spiritual change that brought her from paganism to a new religious belief. So that's a pretty major change, and she will discuss this the rest of the poem. Um, line 2 says that after being brought, she was taught. So again, personification abounds. It's mercy doing the teaching, and it's her soul that's doing the learning. So the change here is that there is a new relationship with God and a new system of beliefs. It's so dramatic that it's changed her soul. Going from country to country is one thing, but changing your soul is another ball game.
On line 4, the author doesn't say anything about changes. However, she talks about her past. The implication is that she never knew or sought for redemption, but now she does. It's significant to her message. It's all about the power of changing belief systems, thoughts, and actions. She's maybe appealing to an African audience that was also brought over from Africa to tell them that souls can change. Then on line 7, we have that she's asking white people to change their preconceptions about black people. Christianity has changed her spiritual freedom, but not her political freedom has yet changed. Whitley said that she has found Christianity, but Christians are not following their own principles. Finally, on line 8, as we already mentioned, Whitley was refined in some way through her education. She could read and write, she studied Latin, Greek, and also the Bible. She was raised by a prominent family in Boston. She was the first black poet in America to publish a book. We know that she was refined, but what she's talking about in this line is being freed of impurities through the faith in God. Ever I forget people think of her and her race as diabolical. She's living proof that mercy and conversion can refine the souls of faithless people. And that's her last message, we thought, that despite of being black or white, change is possible for everyone.
Then we have literary devices. The poet has also used a few of them in this poem to express her ideas. First, we have assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds in the same line. For example, the sound of in may be refined and joined the angelic strain. Then we have consonance, which is the repetition of consonant sounds in the same line. For example, the sound of t in "To was mercy brought me from my pagan land." taught my benighted soul to understand. Then we have alliteration, which is the repetition of consonant sounds in the same line in quick succession. There is only one alliteration in the poem, which is the sound of the. In their color is a diabolic dye.
Imagery. Imagery is used to make readers perceive things involving their five senses. In this part, the author was trying to make the readers understand and see what she was talking about. We have some view or sable race with scornful eye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, and their color is a diabolic dye. Then we have symbolism. Symbolism is use of symbols to signify ideas and qualities by giving them symbolic meanings that they are different from the literal meanings. Here we have sable race, symbolizing the African race. And at last we have personification. Personification is to give human qualities to inanimate objects. For example, mercy is personified in the opening lines of the poem. That was our presentation. Thank you all for listening. And if you have any question, please ask them now, after the beep. Beep. Well, if someone has any question, this was a short presentation because our book or report was about the poem. It was a very short poem, but it has like a lot of deep meanings inside. So please go ahead.
Well, in the meantime, your classmates may decide on a question or anything that was not clear enough. I guess I'm going to start. Okay. So my first question is connected with something you mentioned, and which is the audience, because a writer always writes for someone. It's having a conversation with a future reader of the literary work itself. In this case, who was the intended audience of the poem? What do you think? And if you had a different audience, different readers, in which way the interpretation would vary?
I think that the readers, like the public for this poem, are two. The first one is, as Whitley has an experience with slavery and everything, she was like referring to other people like her, like people that moved from Africa that were took away from her or his country to America, and they share this experience, these feelings, these emotions. And the other public, I think that maybe are us, like the future people for her, because we can in some way have like a picture of what was happening during those years. And it was like a first-hand experience. It's like very strong, I think, for us to hear that or read about that.
And besides what Luciana just said, I feel like she was also trying to target the audience that she was surrounded with. Because she wasn't as the other slaves, she had an education. So maybe she was trying to criticize the society she was in because of what she was living as well.
That is a very interesting point, because criticism might be present in the story depending on the readers. Some readers consider that her criticism of slavery or of slavery as an institution was not strong enough, was not explicit. Others believe that under the conditions that she lived as a slave and a writer, it was impossible for her to be straightforward in her criticism to this social problem or issue. So do you think there was a very clear, explicit criticism to slavery as an institution in this poem?
Not really. Just because of what you said, she was a different type of slave. She was under the care of, or under the family. So she was in debt in some areas because she was being educated, she was being treated as one of the family, so it was very difficult for her just to be as straightforward as maybe she wanted to be because of her situation. And that didn't necessarily mean that she was accepting the fact that she was a slave and that slavery was good. She just had to do it in a different way.
Yeah,
Very
and this,
interesting. Luciano, go ahead, please.
oh, sorry. I think that despite of the fact that being a slave is something bad, she like took some advantages of that, or thanks to that, she could do some things that other slaves couldn't. So I think that they are very different in that way.
Very good points. Very good points. She was like in the middle of a road, criticizing slavery as a social issue that was affecting her own or people who underwent the same harsh conditions from being kidnapped in ships and being brought in this transatlantic travel to this new land, and also being grateful to a family of Christian slaveholders who gave her an education that the other slaves would not receive because, plantation, for example, plantation slaves had a very tough and rough life out there in the cotton fields. So I guess she was grateful for the education, but at the same time, she wasn't blind to what was happening to the rest of her peers. You mentioned once a redemption neither sought nor knew. Does it imply that she was seeking for redemption now? She was looking for being Christian and becoming a Christian.
No, she wasn't, because she didn't know that Christianity existed. She wasn't aware of that. So it's like, oh, I didn't know that I could be a part of this redemption. She wasn't looking for it, but because of the circumstances, she ended up being taken from her home. So it wasn't something that she wanted nor needed.
All right, all right. That's interesting for you as a reader to assess, right? Because sometimes when you have experiences, learning experiences that open your eyes, sometimes you may realize that before you thought that you didn't need something, but now that your eyes are opened, maybe you realize that it was actually something that you really, really needed in your life. Um, because she mentioned at some point pagan, um, from my pagan land, and pagan as seen from a Christian point of view is savage and civilized, away from God's laws. So what is she making a moral judgment there about um, pagan and Christian?
I think that as her country is not a land of God or with Christians, it's a kind of sarcasm related to the Christianity and everything that she's living like after that. Because she also mentioned like in the same group as when she said Negroes and black as Cain, she also she also included the word Christians. So she said like even them can have like a redemption or like be refined.
Right. In this last heroic couplet, remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain. Who's she talking to? Is she talking to Christians? Is she talking to black people? Is she talking to everyone, Christians and pagan black people? What do you
Yes,
think?
I think that she's talking about everyone, not only referring to Christians.
Yeah, she's trying to make them equal. That's why she mentions them in the same sentence, because she's addressing to everyone, I think.
No, that's good. And remember, interpretation is a huge element when you are reading either a book or a poem. So, in which way is she making the audience equal? In which way is she making Christians and Black people, everyone in society equal? What
She's
argument is
making,
she? Mhm.
sorry, she's
Go ahead,
making them
please.
equal as when she's saying that they can all be refined, as all people have the same opportunities for redemption, and not only like Negroes or Christians. Like her case was she was an African slave that could find redemption. Not it not was it wasn't like something like she impedes to be a refined being African. Oh.
Right. And what does it mean to be refined anyway? Does it have a negative, a positive connotation, a neutral connotation? What do you think? To be refined?
I think in this case, it's like a positive connotation because of the whole Christianity thing. And she says the angelic train, so it's like the path of God, and as she said before, redemption. So it's like something positive. They can be changed, they can be helped somehow through God and the Savior that she got to know because of um, her own experience. Which doesn't mean that she accepts, because as Luciano said before, it can all be sarcasm. It depends on how you are analyzing the poem and your own point of view.
Good point. Tone has a lot to do with the exact message that the author is trying to convey, right? And uh, the author decides on a voice, not a narrator in a poem, but a voice, right? And the voice can be the author's voice, or he can use a different character to express what he or she wants to say as an author, right? The just like Tom Sawyer, sorry, Huckleberry Finn conveyed the voice, but in that case was sort of a main character of the story and what's narrating from his perspective, right? In this case, the voice of the poet is shown here and expressing ideas. Now, she was implicitly, I guess, referring to refined in the sense of becoming a Christian, and then everyone can have the same equal opportunity of going to heaven and be saved as long as you become a Christian. But if you decide to stay a pagan, as her previous condition and the condition of many of her peers, right, and African American, sorry, and African relatives, or the society that which she was part of before, they do not have the same opportunity. So in this case, she might be defending Christianity as an institution as the only and sole possibility of being refined or being able to. So everyone is equal as long as you're Christian. But if you're not Christian, you're not equal. Is she sending that message? Is that is reading between the lines? What do you think?
I think that it can be, but as you already mentioned, it's depending on the voice that the author is talking about, is using. Sorry, because it can be like a Christian poem if you read it in some way, and in another can be like an irony against the Christianity.
Right, that's a very a complex point you're making here because we should be very aware of the tone that's really being used by the author, and in the case of a poem, probably the word choices can give us a clue, right? The specific words and also some biographical facts can help us to
Yes.
understand, right? And previous works, you mentioned that as well, right?
Yes. Her previous poem. I think that it's important for this poem to know the background, history, and information about the author, because we can connect some facts and infer some things that we couldn't if we don't know anything about the author.
Right. Any comments, any questions from anybody in the audience? What do you think?
Hello, Mister.
Come again?
Yes, I wanted to say that I like the part of the story they tell about the author, where they mentioned that she was the third woman who published something and a literary work like that, and the first to be a slave. That's a very powerful. I felt like it was very powerful information about the author. It's very interesting, and that's why I wanted to. Well, I wanted to ask the partners that if they know if still there are situations like that of the author of slavery nowadays, if they know something, because well, we all know something, but that it resembles her situation.
Sorry, you want to know how's her situation? I don't.
No,
Can you repeat the question, please?
sorry. The I want to say that I like the information you gave about her, but I wanted to ask that if you know that if there is someone nowadays in her
Oh,
same situation or groups of people, like she was a black slave from South Africa, maybe now there's another kind of group.
I mean, as Javiera mentioned before, we have now this whole movement of Black Lives Matter. Um, so racism is still something that we have to change nowadays, which it's not something that we have to be proud of because we are in the 21st century. So thinking that this problem still remains nowadays is awful for us as a society. We have this whole situation as well with George Floyd, who was murdered by this policeman. So I think that it's not the same situation, of course, but they are still suffering because of it. So it's kind of similar somehow.
Yes, we don't know anything about cases of slaves nowadays. However, the discrimination against Black people or African Americans is like being a big theme and topic nowadays or now.
Right. Thank you very much, Javier. Does anyone else have any comment or question to the group? Alrighty. Therefore, I guess we should call it a day. Um, Very, very interesting poem, and there are many variations about the interpretations given to the poem. As Luciano and Barbara mentioned, the tone makes a big impact on how you perceive this, if it's explicit criticism towards slavery, or she is being, I would say, a little bit weak on her criticism and being more grateful about her current state as a Christian. I'm playing the devil's advocate here because I'm a Christian personally, but there's you need to address and analyze literary works from different perspectives, right? So that's something important. And allusion is a very very key literary device here, as she is addressing right the Bible, and she mentions, as you remember, you mentioned Cain, right? And all this connection with between or association between the black color and whatever is evil, right? Black equals evil, equals pagan or uncivilized or savage, and or diabolic. So that's the connotation that she is referring to in the first lines, but at the same time at the bottom sending a message of equality. I think I'm sharing this statue of Phillys Wheatley. She doesn't have an open criticism to slavery, as we can see, for example, in Olaudah Equiano, in his interesting narrative, Life of Himself, right? In which he describes this passage, this being kidnapped and being on a ship and all the harsh treatment in this ship, or the narration given by Frederick Douglass. They are long slave narratives that describe very detailed the complex situations are undergone by by slaves who eventually managed to escape being a slave and became advocates of the abolitionist movements, right? The anti-slavery movements. The case of Frederick Douglass was very, very particular because he became an advocate of the abolitionist movement. Even he went to Europe as a speaker, right, to defend the abolitionist movement and to arise support for this cause. So if you look at these examples of the slave narratives written by Olaudah Equiano, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, it's going to be analyzed by Yomali, Maria Jose, and Nicole Bastías later, you may feel that it's the poem is like too warm, too weak, not headlong, not addressing straightforward the fact and all the mistreatment given to slaves. But anyway, put it in context. She was a slave. She received a highly sophisticated education, and she managed to speak and write in many different languages, and she managed to write poetry, which was quite sophisticated at the time, even for someone who wasn't born a slave. So there are many achievements to Phillys Wheatley's life that we have to be. We need to put on her shoes in order to understand if frontal criticism was possible during those days, right? Probably not. Luciano Barbara, thank you very much for your report on this short but very rich poem with lots of literary devices. I think the analysis was very carefully done, and I think it was a good decision to record your presentation, considering that sometimes some elements are missed when there are technical issues in a book report. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Barbara. And we'll see you on Thursday, God willing. Nothing on my part. Thank you, Luciano.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
you very much.
And goodbye, everyone. Have a good day. Good rest of the day.
Oh, yes. You too, Professor.